Just a couple of questions. The overall funding package that was announced, where do you see the bulk of those resources going?
Will
The
be
point four
primarily
wouldn't count towards the public debt, the IMF facility.
It
I'm
will.
asking you. Multilateral sources, I think, of 6.7 billion US for the Hurricane Melissa recovery. That works out, I think, somewhere in the region of 20% of GDP, depending, where GDP is, but somewhere in that region. I noticed that the government's projections indicate that the debt-to-GDP ratio doesn't get elevated in the medium term beyond 68% or thereabouts. How does that, and given that the projected rates of growth are quite modest, and we have to recover from a reduction in real GDP this fiscal year as a result of the catastrophe, how does that square in terms? I know that for some of it is private sector and probably won't come on the books as debt, but over 4 billion of it, I think, is loans of some sort. So how does that, that's what I was saying, is around 20% of GDP, the loan portion. So how does that square with your projections for debt to GDP growth?
The government presents a $6.7 billion Hurricane Melissa recovery package, a figure repeatedly cited as being equivalent to roughly 20% of Jamaica's GDP. However, once questioned, that headline number begins to shift. Minister Williams explains that $700 million represents Jamaica's own resources and does not constitute debt. A further $2.4 billion is attributed to private sector financing, which also does not appear on the public balance sheet. This immediately removes more than half of the announced package from any meaningful debt analysis.
Member, yes, you're right about the 6.7 billion. You have to subtract off of that the 0.7, which is our own resources, not debt, just resources, from the cat bond and other
What
areas.
figure is that?
0.7,
Yeah.
so that leaves 6,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Minus off the 2.4 for private sector. So that would leave you with 3.6.
Okay.
There is, call it 0.4, which is the IMF facility that we have received already. That is to help us with balance of payment support. So that
doesn't count towards the debt to
3.2.
GDP.
But anyhow,
She didn't literally add the IMF money to pad the total, but she brought it in at a moment that muddied the math, just enough to make it feel like it belonged in the same pile Mark was questioning. And that wasn't about winning the arithmetic. It was about defending the headline. Her goal in that moment wasn't to give a neat classroom-style breakdown. It was to protect the debt-to-GDP projection. By pointing to the IMF facility and saying, "This doesn't count toward public debt," she was effectively saying, "Relax. Not all of this money bites the same way." That's reassuring politically and fiscally, even if it's a little untidy mathematically. It also shifted the conversation. Mark was pressing on size. How big is the borrowing, really? By introducing the IMF right there, she nudged the debate away from totals and toward categories. What kind of money is this? How is it treated? And does it behave like ordinary borrowing? In policy terms, that's a classic sidestep. Not a dodge, just a reframing that buys you breathing room. There's another layer, too. Mark's real worry wasn't just the math, it was growth. His point was simple. These projections assume growth, and Jamaica's growth record hasn't exactly been sprinting. If the conversation stayed locked on arithmetic, the next question would be awkward. What if growth doesn't show up? By widening the frame to accounting treatment and IMF distinctions, she steered the spotlight away from that uncertainty. And remember, Parliament isn't a lecture hall. Ministers answer under pressure in a combative setting, with headlines waiting outside the door. So instead of laying out the equation, the assumptions, and the risks, she opted for something safer: plausible reassurance, technical cover, and no dramatic debt headlines. Clarity was the casualty. But here's the key point. It worked. At the end, Mark says, "All right." Not convinced, perhaps, but disarmed enough to move on.
The 3.2, after you take off the 0.4, will be primarily...
The 0.4 wouldn't count towards the public debt, the IMF facility. I'm asking you.
Yes, it
Okay.
will. The 3.2 that's left it's considered investment loans, so it's very project specific, and you are able to access it once you have defined what the projects are. So the point is, we will not be taking this all at once on our books. It will be spread out over time, and you can see how your debt to GDP can be managed over a period of time.
But the medium-term projections are where I was focused on, where the debt to GDP ratio peaks at around 68% as projected. I would imagine these facilities would be drawn down over a similar period.
Right, but also there's growth, there's recovery in the GDP that will help as well. Yes, we have to have recovery. We've seen recovery after the pandemic. We've seen recovery after Hurricane Beryl. So there's no reason not to expect full recovery.
But recovery to where you were is one thing, but after recovery, what we've seen is that we've normalized back to very modest levels of growth. So, all of us would like to see that dynamic change, but that's the main conundrum facing the economy. So I'm just questioning, how you accommodate over that medium-term period all those additional loans and stick within that projection as to the debt to GDP.
So again, member, two things would be happening. One, the growth in the GDP, that would help your debt to GDP ratio, and the fact that we will judiciously take on these loans over time.
Yeah, but as you borrow them, they accumulate.
Right, but your GDP is growing as well.
Yeah.
So, that's that balance.
What's missing from this exchange isn't intent, it's numbers. The argument the government is making only works if certain assumptions hold. But those assumptions are never stated. We don't hear what GDP growth rate is being assumed. Is it 2%, 3%, 5%? And more importantly, for how many years does that growth need to continue for the debt projections to remain stable? We also don't hear how quickly the loans are expected to be drawn down. Are we talking about $500 million a year? Is the borrowing front-loaded in the early years or spread evenly over time? Because the pace of borrowing directly affects when debt pressures show up. And then there's the most important question of all. What happens if growth underperforms? If growth falls short?
The other question I had relates to the housing program, the roof program, which seems to be the main housing repair and recovery program announced. And it's roughly 60 million US, thereabouts, 10 billion Jamaican dollars. And that represents less than 10% of that less than 1% of that $6.7 billion funding envelope that has been identified. So where do you see the bulk of those resources going, of that $6.7 billion? What areas do you anticipate that financing over the time?
When Mark Golding turned to the housing program, he focused on a single number, and it was a deliberate choice. Just $60 million was allocated to roof repairs. In the context of a $6.7 billion Hurricane Melissa recovery package, that works out to less than 1%. This wasn't a throwaway observation. It was a contrast meant to signal priorities.
So this financing from the international financial institutions must go towards reconstruction, restoration. It must go towards building resilience so that the next time around, God forbid, we're not thrown back in the way that we were through Melissa. So you will see the bulk of this going into capital spending over the next 5 years or so. If obviously we're borrowing, and we have to make the borrowing count. We have to make the borrowing go towards capital spending in water infrastructure, in road development, in things that will produce growth for the Jamaican economy.
When Mark Golding pointed out that less than 1% of the recovery package was allocated to roofing, Minister Williams didn't dispute the number. The figure itself was left standing. Instead, she reframed the discussion. Rather than addressing roofing directly, she spoke more broadly about reconstruction, restoration, and building resilience. The emphasis shifted away from individual homes and toward national systems. She explained that the bulk of the borrowing would be directed toward capital spending, roads, water infrastructure, and projects designed to support long-term economic growth. In that framing, roofing was no longer the focal point. Economic resilience was.
You saw early right after the aftermath of the hurricane, there were a lot of resources dedicated to the relief effort to get people food, shelter, to ensure that they could begin to get on their feet again. But we have moved out of the relief stage, or are moving out of the relief stage into reconstruction and recovery, building in resilience as we go along, so that these loans can produce the kinds of investments that will lead to stronger GDP growth.
Williams also drew a line between relief and recovery. She noted that immediate relief, food, shelter, and emergency support, came first, and that the country was now moving into a longer phase of reconstruction and recovery. What she didn't do was explain why roofing represented such a small share of the overall package, or whether additional housing support would be provided elsewhere. Those questions weren't answered directly. So while Golding was questioning priorities at the household level, Williams responded by outlining a strategy focused on long-term infrastructure and growth. The facts weren't challenged. The focus was changed. So when you step back and look at the exchange as a whole, the picture becomes clearer. The government defended its debt projections by emphasizing how the recovery package is structured, what counts as debt, what's excluded, and how borrowing is spread out over time. But the assumptions that make that strategy work, growth rates, loan drawdowns, and what happens if growth falls short, were never put on the table. Mark Golding pressed on those pressure points, from debt sustainability to household recovery, highlighting that less than 1% of the package was allocated to roofing, the most visible and immediate form of hurricane damage. That number wasn't disputed. It was reframed. What emerged wasn't a disagreement over facts, but a difference in priorities. Long-term infrastructure and fiscal stability on one side, immediate household recovery and realism about growth on the other. The structure was explained, the risks were implied, but the numbers that would fully test the plan were left unstated. And that's where the conversation ends, not with answers settled, but with the key questions now clearly defined. Thanks for watching Scoping Jamaica.